thanks everyone for joining us after lunch for this panel on digital regulatory coordination. One thing we always hear about when we speak to Tech UK members is that the kind of, as technology has changed, as it's becoming more pervasive to more different kinds of businesses and the way society works, the question of regulation has increased up and up and up, and their kind of risk registers and questions about how they run their business. Even in the polling that we've done through our digital economy monitor, kind of a stable regulatory environment, ease of complying with regulation has grown up as a priority for businesses in our sector, but we also know in many others. Into that, we had in around, I think it was in 2020 or 2021, the Ofcom, the CMA and the ICO formed the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, and then shortly joined by the FCA afterwards to have a think about how digital technology and digital regulation is not just touching on various different parts of the economy, but also society, and to kind of try and stitch together a coherent and coordinated approach to the different regimes are going around, whether it's privacy, competition, communications, etc. However, this question has kind of got bigger and bigger over time. Since leaving the European Union, the UK's regulators have been asked to do more and more and more. And we've also seen new bits of legislation and new regimes, from the Data Protection Digital Information Bill, the AI White Paper, the Digital Markets Competition Bill, Telecom Security, and new financial services regulation, that are raising these questions more and more. So what we wanted to do was really kind of get the regulators together and have a chat about what's going on behind the scenes, how they're working together, and how they're trying to fulfill their duties, not only to protect consumers, but also to support economic growth. And to answer that question, I'm delighted to be joined by, well, the UK's digital regulators. So if there's a panel that you don't want to say something wrong in front of, it's definitely this one. So I'm very excited to be joined by Stephen Almond, who's the Executive Director of Regulatory Risk at the ICO, Kate Davies, Director of Public Policy at Ofcom, Matthew Braovac, who's the Director of Digital Markets, or is a Director in the Digital Markets Unit at the CMA, and Catherine Croxon, who's Deputy Chief Economist at the FCA. Now, the one thing that often gets asked about regulation is, well, it's all quite complicated and it can be quite confusing sometimes. But my sort of question to you guys is, has it actually got more complicated and more confusing in the last 4 years with all the kind of additional duties that have appeared at your doors? Stephen, I want to go to you first.
Thanks. Well, look, the short answer is, has it got more complicated? Yes, it has. We're seeing we're going through a period of massive technological convergence, with various different worlds colliding with one another. And at the same time, we're seeing a period of real regulatory convergence. So we're seeing lots of areas of regulation that were once sort of separate. I'm not going to claim that they were really separate. We were already talking a lot before. And we're seeing those areas of regulation come into closer intersection. Now, has it got kind of more complicated in terms of the different moving parts here? Yes. But it's our job as this group of 4 regulators to make it easy. And actually, one of the things that we are really, really committed to doing, working together, is to try and make a cohesive regulatory framework where actually it's completely joined up, no matter kind of what angle we're regulating from. The firms that we're working with have a joined up experience of engaging with us.
I think that's a really important point. It's often a question that's raised by some members of, do I need to go to Ofcom or the ICO for this question, particularly around cybersecurity? Kate, I want to ask you the same question. Ofcom obviously has a huge range of remits, growing from a communications regulator all the way up to now kind of thinking about the implementation of the online safety regime. Do you find it's got more complicated?
I mean, I think I broadly agree with what Stephen was saying. I think it's very much an evolution. I don't think it's a cliff edge and there's been a sort of change from one moment to the next. I mean, in terms of the sort of communications experience in the UK, we're continuing to serve consumers right across how they now use communications. It just turns out the platforms they're using them on have changed. And I think the sort of approach in 2003 to set up Ofcom as a converged communications regulator has sort of really stood the test of time. In terms of what that means, and it sort of builds on Stephen's point, I think the onus is on us. So the onus is on us to work collaboratively, which is why we set up this forum. But it's also on us in terms of how we approach our work individually. So, I think both in terms of engaging with new forms and new approaches to regulation, so increasingly more principles-based approaches. The online safety bill takes a systems and processes approach as opposed to thinking about individual pieces of content. how we think about engaging with innovation, so sandboxes, the work we do around spectrum and different bits of diversification, setting up labs with industry to look at new solutions. So I think there's all sorts of ways we can engage with this question and respond to it.
And the FCA obviously joined the DRCF slightly later on. Do you think it changed, like, sort of fundamentally in a large way, the way you worked with your other regulators, or was it kind of a natural evolution of the approach that you were taking to kind of coordinate together anyway?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I mean, I think it's enhanced, you know, the opportunities to do that and really get under the skin of what can be some of the most complex digital issues that we're facing. And obviously, you know, the backdrop there is, you know, always evolving, which is excellent. I mean, just to say a few things about the FCA, I'm conscious that, you know, some of your audience may be very familiar with us as a sector regulator, and that may be a big focus for you right now, and for others, our approach and our regulatory mandate may be a little less well known. So our job is to ensure that financial services markets function well, work well for consumers, get to good consumer market outcomes. This is about protecting consumers, promoting effective competition in the consumer interest, and enhancing the integrity and resilience of the system overall. So that's the brief. And we are inherently technology neutral in our approach and very focused on outcomes, so those good outcomes for consumers and markets. Our new consumer duty helps firms in the markets we regulate understand our expectations in relation to those outcomes. And then they are subject to that, sort of free to take accountability for those outcomes, innovate, be agile, deploy low technology, high technology, different approaches to deliver really great outcomes and set up, you know, viable, hopefully very successful businesses. And so that's the sort of the overarching approach. Now, accountability is really important within that, and we're talking about human accountability, and specifically, we require the firms and their senior managers are accountable for good outcomes for consumers. Are consumers getting fair value in markets? Are they getting good access? Can they be confident in the good treatment and access to these markets and suitable products? So this is the expectation. And you might then wonder, well, what difference does it make if each year, you know, the ball moves forward a little bit on a technological front? I think, you know, despite everything, technology does then bring some complexity and everything that then moves around that in the ecosystem. And it creates huge opportunities, but also some risks. I think it has implications for our work as a regulator and means that we are more in the market and get more out of this deeper collaboration. And I think the DRCF, you know, it's been an excellent example of that for us. We also, as an individual regulator, it's very important that we're both understanding the harms and potential opportunities and sort of really addressing both and getting ahead of things, and doing that individually. So we have a lot of empirical work, a lot of collaboration and engagement ourselves with experts, academics, industry, and so on, but also that we're doing that collaboratively to ensure that coherence at the highest level that Stephen talked about and that kind of Kate built on.
And when we get to that question, sort of how complicated it is, the Digital Markets Competition Consumer Bill is going to give the Digital Markets Unit quite a lot of power to look at lots of potential tensions that sometimes pop up in the regulatory regime. You know, it might be questions around data portability, open choices, various different things. How do you think that how useful do you think the DRCF is going to be to that kind of process of building up evidence bases when that bill goes live?
Thanks very much. Look, I think it's really useful. I think it's really important that we haven't got a blank sheet now. You know, we have done a lot of work in the years past, and we're in a much better place as a result of having done that. So, you know, it has become more complicated. I would also say to what previous panelists have said, expectations are higher. I think expectations from our stakeholders are higher, including government, including our regulatees, and including innovative other businesses who are trying to navigate the regulatory landscape. But that's good. That's a good thing, and we're really happy to take on that challenge. So I think if we look at things like DRCF, but also some of the specific things that are being done, under that banner, thinking about joint horizon scanning, for instance, where we can just survey a much wider range of technologies by doing it together and by collaborating and bringing, you know, that information and the expertise from world-class experts into all of our regulators together makes a big difference. We've also announced, you know, that we're trialing a potential pilot on a multi-agency advice scheme where, you know, we can give advice potentially to innovative companies and, you know, try to help them navigate that complexity. So I think that's where we are. I think the DMCC bill, when it comes, you know, it adds to that, but it will just be a continuation of the same. And of course, under the current proposed legislation, there are also consultation obligations on the CMA, you know, when thinking about how to exercise powers under that bill, specifically to go and talk to other regulators, including the regulators represented here. And I think that's right, and I think it's just demonstrating the fact that we're now taking something which started as a slightly informal thing, and it's showing that actually it's becoming more and more solidified, you know, and more formal in its approach. And I think that's great because it gives some real I think confidence to stakeholders that, you know, this approach is here to stay, and that's very clearly the way that I think it's going to develop.
I'm keen to kind of, when we get onto the questions of accountability, look at that consultation requirement in the bill. One of the things I wanted to pick up just in this last bit, when we kind of talk about how the DRCF has gone and how it's evolved, is there's a lot of questions at the moment about whether our regulators are resourced well enough to kind of deal with the challenge that they're being tasked with. That not only comes from the fact that since leaving the European Union, we've lost access to those kind of broader networks, but also the kind of demands, as Matthew says, kind of are growing and growing, whether it's from the AI white paper or from various bits of legislation. On the whole, is the DRCF an effective way of saving resource, or is it something that adds to kind of your to-do list at the end of the day, Kate?
I mean, look, I'd definitely say that it enhances our capabilities. So, of course, it takes work to work together. Let's not pretend otherwise. But it means that we are more effective and efficient in the work that we do. So, as Matthew was saying, if we talk about horizon scanning, if we're all thinking, oh gosh, we need to look at the metaverse as we did last year, and engaging on that collectively and thinking, you know, really proactively and ahead of time, where do these regulatory issues come together and where do we think about them jointly most effectively? That means sort of down the road we will be more efficient and effective. We're obviously also doing work specifically around skills and capabilities to make sure that we are leveraging as much as possible communally to be as effective as possible in that area.
And my sort of sense from speaking to you both off the panel and the kind of discussion is that you meet fairly regularly.
Yes.
Is there a DRCF WhatsApp group?
There actually isn't, which makes me quite sad to say.
There isn't, but I think probably what you can see from the kind of the rapport between us as a panel is actually we are, you know, we probably speak to some of each other more than we do other colleagues within our own organisations. And I think, you know, sometimes people have this sort of debate about kind of regulatory structures and kind of moving deck chairs, etc. But actually, the structures are irrelevant as long as the collaboration works. And I think the collaboration works really, really well.
Yeah, it was interesting to kind of move on to that question of how the Eurogroup is also kind of trying to support innovation in the sector. It's one of the things which has come up a lot in the kind of DRCF work plan, and it seems to have taken on a particular kind of focus in the most recent one. There's obviously the project that the ICO is leading with the Regulators Pioneer Fund and the kind of cross-industry support system. But I wanted to come to you first, just from a kind of experience of the FCA sandbox, which is often kind of cited as kind of the first major kind of regulatory support scheme to boost innovation and has grown a lot of fintechs. Those schemes are obviously really important to supporting innovation, but how do they support you in your kind of regulatory duties as well?
Yeah, another really good question. Because I think there is a real, you know, it's symbiotic, you know, when you think about the aims we have and how we're looking to support that positive innovation in the social interest. You know, innovation has been a very important part of our focus for some time now. For some time we've had a regulatory sandbox, as you mentioned. So, you know, again, some may be very into this and others less so. So this is an opportunity that firms, they could be incumbents or new entrants, have to test out both at once the commercial viability and the ability to meet consumers' needs of new products and services or business models at the same time as sort of, if you like, testing out the regulatory viability. Is this going to produce a harm for consumers? Is there sort of a compelling benefit? Do some safeguards need to be put in place, and so on and so forth? So that's the approach. And we've had some real innovation coming through there, and success. But I think we also we're not complacent around that. Every year we are looking to enhance the services we offer. Recently, I think in 2020, we set up something called the Digital Sandbox, which is actually aimed a little more upstream of that at innovators who have an idea, want to get to that first proof of concept. Maybe it would really help them to have access to synthetic data and public data sets so that they can begin to kick the tires on the approach and get to that next level. So that's something we've been doing. We also have what we term tech sprints, which are a kind of a form of hackathon that we've been running for some time now. We pick off an important, it might be a regulatory challenge, an industry challenge, a societal challenge. Empowerment of women in financial services would be one example, AML and financial crime another. We've had quite a few topics, and we bring together the ecosystem, and we kind of get people together, and it's all about innovation and trying to sort of push the thinking a little bit on what might be possible, what it might take in the real world to make some progress on some of these quite thorny issues. So those are some of the things that we're doing. I think in terms of then, how it benefits us, it benefits us enormously because it's a real window into sort of live or near live deployment of some state-of-the-art technologies. It helps us really have a ringside seat and sort of get under the skin of that. One of the teams in my area is our behavioural science and design unit, and actually, that team over the years has been very involved in working alongside at times and advising some of the firms in the sandboxes about the user interface design, the online choice architecture, if you like, as people call it these days, and some of the considerations there from a behavioural science point of view. But that's really just one tiny slither of the bigger picture. So and then of course we get feedback from that, and it deepens our understanding. Coming back to the DRCF, again, I think we're always looking to learn. We're always looking to grow. Yes, we have opportunities to share some of that experience in the DRCF. We have opportunities to create new things together. And I think that's very much what we're doing. And so I think there's a ton of synergy. One thing I did just want to add as well is the innovation, if you like, is also critically important inside a regulator, certainly like ourselves. So that other complexity comes from sort of like, how do we actually harness all of this data and all of this technology ourselves as regulators to enhance our own effectiveness and efficiency as a regulator? So we've got a huge program around that as part of our own data-driven, sort of technology-driven transformation. I know other regulators have as well. So that's an area to build common understanding, common capacity, and really sort of get under the skin of how you kind of move things forward on that front.
Yeah, and it's interesting because sandboxes come up quite a lot. Often if you're sort of submitting a policy paper to the government or a discussion comes along, people suggest a sandbox to fix a problem they maybe don't necessarily know the answer to. But in some cases, they can be quite useful to address a range of different problems. I know the ICO has used them to kind of try and expand its understanding. I'd be interested from your perspective, what are the kind of the uses of sandboxes, but also the limitations? Stephen, sorry. So
the ICO offers a range of innovation services, and it's really important for us that we have basically a kind of a service to fit each sort of problem that comes through the door. So we recognise that actually for some organisations, what they want is rapid regulatory clarity. They're not sure on how data protection law, which is a principles-based framework, would apply to their specific situation. And actually, they just want to know, look, what does the regulator think? What are you going to say on that? So we have an innovation advice service that we've been piloting and is currently open to applications. Encourage anybody in the audience to submit their questions of us. For that, the speed is really important. So it's about coming back from us within 15 working days with an answer, because we recognise that development cycles mean that organisations want rapid regulatory clarity. Now, we have services that build on that. So our regulatory sandbox, much as per Karen's description, actually is really about creating a more in-depth space for experimentation with us as a regulator. Whilst you are going through that period of testing and trialling your product, trying to actually go through the process of testing and trialling with us, how the regulation might interact with us. And that's, it's a resource-intensive process for us, but that's where we focus our resource on the most exciting, the most novel things, and we run a competitive process to partner with us in that space. We also, and this is kind of some of the I suppose a forerunner of what we'll be doing through DRCF, is we also work really closely with other regulators. So we have an innovation hub within the ICO that partners, for example, with the FCA sandbox. And so if you are coming to the FCA and you have a question that actually is bordering on the sort of the data protection side of things, actually you get really seamless service. You get, there will be ICO advisors often in the background who'll be able to say, okay, well, look, there's a data protection angle to this. Here we can help around this. So that's something that I think, as we're starting to work through this multi-agency advice service pilot that Matthew talked about, we're really excited about, because there's so many opportunities to scale that sort of collaboration. There's so many novel technological opportunities that are coming up. So between the ICO and Ofcom, we're always talking about safety tech, for example. It'd be great to see people coming and talking to us both about that. So I think it's an area of real growth for us. I hope it's an area of real opportunity for industry.
I mean, that sort of, it all sounds fantastic in kind of principle, and it's been really interesting to see the kind of work you'll be doing in that space. But it does sound quite resource intensive at a time when you're, being asked to do a lot more things. How do you kind of balance that against your existing duties? But also be interested to understand kind of the role that the Regulators Pioneers Fund has played in this as a kind of external source of funding for that kind of program.
So look, I see this as work that is win-win-win. It's good for industry in terms of getting clarity from us as regulators. It's good for us as regulators because we get, as Karen was saying, that insight into things early in the market, which actually really helps inform our work. And it's better for consumers as well, who get both the innovations coming earlier to market with greater confidence that actually protections are built in up front. So I see that not as some nice sort of add-on to our regulatory role, but a core part of it. The Regulators Pioneer Fund sort of financing of this is, you can think of it as kind of Kickstarter funding, as it were. It's helping us go through the process of piloting this, and actually we're going through a period right now of doing quite intensive engagement with firms to understand actually what do they want from us. It's all very well us saying, oh yes, we think that firms want this sort of advisory service from us, etc. But we're really trying to test and build that proposition. So that finance is really helping us make sure that we are not just producing a service that we think industry wants, but it's actually something that's solving a real problem for industry.
That's really helpful. And Matthew, just to kind of, the CMA is, I think, slightly different from the other three in the sense in that, to my knowledge, is not a kind of extensive use of sandboxes and these kind of functions, but it might be something that you need to look at as a kind of more ex-ante regime comes on stream. I'd be interested to kind of get what sort of thoughts you maybe initially had, or what experience you might have drawn on from your regulator colleagues as you think about the more ex-ante approach you're going to have to take in future.
Well, look, I think that's exactly right. We haven't done that so much in the past as typically an ex-post competition law enforcer, but as you say, the digital markets unit within the CMA is actually going to be doing quite a different job. Yeah. It is going to be much, more similar, if you like, to the organizations otherwise represented on this panel. And so I think we're in a position to learn from that. But I think that, stuff that we have already put out about the way that we envisage that regime working, being participative, being open to iteration, consulting widely, these are all sorts of bits of best practice that we see from other ex-ante regulators. And I think that, for the reasons that Stephen and others have just given, I think that this is just another example where where we can build into that space, because we will be doing, a new job, a different job from the one that the CMA has done in the past, and will of course have to continue to do on a kind of parallel track of being both an ex-ante regulator and continuing with our competition and consumer powers.
And there's potentially, quite a lot of evidence and case studies that have come up from the other regulators. So we've got about 10 minutes left of discussion before I'm going to the audience for questions. So please do think of your questions and be ready. But I've just got a few more questions for our panel before I let you have a go at them. So maybe not so much have a go, but give them a accountability. Look, that comes up a lot. People because regulators are getting potentially more powers, particularly over regimes like the Online Safety Bill and others that affect people's day-to-day lives. The question of accountability has come up and up again. And I wanted to get a sense, the DRCF itself talks a lot about this, and there was a kind of an interesting response from your last Chief Executive, Jill Whitehead, to a letter that Nadine Dorey sent saying, we'll be more open and try and publish as much as we can in our plan. How are you kind of approaching that kind of demand for more accountability? Kate, I'll go to you first.
Thanks. I mean, look, I think that's right. I think as individual regulators, and then I'll come on to DRCF. So, in terms of Ofcom, accountability is absolutely core. We publish a plan of work every year. We set out an annual report that explains how we've delivered against that. We're obviously accountable to Parliament, but then accountable through the courts, and regularly have decisions tested, as is right. And really, really accountable to consumers, both through complaints, but also through considerable amounts of consumer research to make sure that we understand what's going on for people in their day-to-day lives, because that is our core duty to deliver for citizens and consumers. In terms of the DRCF, I mean, it's a voluntary forum. So I think it is absolutely right that then flows from sort of each of our very good sense of accountability that it needs to be accountable, but it does stem from the individual regulators, if you like, rather than from the forum itself. But again, decided very early on, this is not just a talking shop. We are going to set out a work plan. We're going to publish everything we do. We're going to set out a report alongside the work plan. And this year, for the first time, actually sort of consulted in advance of the work plan to say, what does everybody want to see in it? So really very much best practice across all that, threading that through to DRCF. Because it's, if we're not accountable, we're not trusted. And then kind of what are we here for? So no, it's really, really important.
Yeah, it's been interesting to hear that shift from just 1 year to a next kind of being taken forward. I had sort of another question, and it applies to some regulators but not others. The government will issue sort of strategic steers and also plans for what it kind of wants to see from the regulators that operate on behalf of Parliament and the government. I just had a question about things like the plan for digital regulation. I know this doesn't apply to the FCA, but certainly for the CMA, Ofcom and the ICO. When a plan like that is issued, what is kind of your response to it? How do you digest it and flow it through your work programs? Stephen, I'll come to you first.
So I think it's worth saying that actually, the principles that are set out in the plan for digital regulation are principles that we take seriously to heart, but also that I'd argue we have been mainstreamed kind of within our approach for quite a long time. So there are principles there around, for example, being principles-based. Now, we're very lucky as a regulator. Actually, that's hardwired into our legislative framework. We have the data protection law is fundamentally principles-based and outcomes-focused. So we're really able to respond to that idea that it should be principles-based, and also that idea that it should be technologically neutral. So for us, I think there are two parts sort of to this. One is recognizing that actually there are core ingredients within our framework, our structures as regulators that enable us to respond to those challenges actually pretty straightforwardly. But then the second bit is, as you would expect from any public body, to always be challenging ourselves to be going further. And that's, to be honest, that's true irrespective of whether we're getting steers from government, whether it's scrutiny from Parliament, whether it's all the external scrutiny and challenge that Kate alluded to. We need to be at the top of our game, always. And that is even more important in a rapid, evolving technological landscape that we're overseeing right now. And so, actually, we really welcome that scrutiny. It is helpful. This is the challenges of technology governance today are not going to be solved by any one mind alone. It's going to be by everybody focusing on the problem, providing that scrutiny and challenge, and we're game for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing which has come up a bit recently that when I've been speaking to MPs in particular, so they sort of have clocked that there's no longer the kind of level of scrutiny that was being applied through the European Union when we had those kind of combined frameworks. So lots of MPs are really thinking about, well, how do we kind of change the way that Parliament might seek to scrutinise regulators? And I'm very aware that actually you spend a lot of time in front of Parliament, and lots of people will know that from following different parliamentary committees that the regulators do go before committees quite a lot. But I wonder, and I'm going to turn to Matthew in this because you'll probably be thinking about how a new regime and a new part of the CMA is going to be scrutinised. How do you think that might change over the next few years, and what kind of different questions might Parliament have of you as a regulator?
Thanks. So look, I just to step back for a moment. I mean, I think we're all moving in the same direction, and again, to a certain extent, the CMA may have been not as far forward in some of this previously. So. This year, for instance, we published our annual plan, which included not just what we're focused on for 12 months, but actually a bit more of a 3-year look. And that is something which I know Ofcom has done, for a number of years. So we are picking up some best practice from other regulators and thinking about that. And when I think about strategic steers and that sort of thing, again, I would echo, what Stephen said. We welcome that. We're very comfortable with that. It's in line with the way that we're thinking about how we prioritize our whole portfolio of work, and we're trying to make sure that we are, not getting too focused just on one part of the economy, but we're actually spreading it, that we're focused on our impact on consumers, on business, and on the wider economy. Now, turning specifically to Parliament, well, as you say, we are regularly in front of select committees. There was one just a couple of weeks ago. There's another one next week, and that's absolutely fine. That is part of the democratic process, and something that we completely welcome. Whether or not additional scrutiny is something that gets looked at as part of the passage of the DMCC, I don't know. That's a matter for government, but it's certainly not something that we shy away from. I think all regulators should. To Stephen's point about challenging ourselves, we should feel absolutely confident about explaining why we're setting the priorities that we're setting, where we're spending the time that we're spending, and we should be very open and transparent about that. We have got limited resources, and they are public resources, and we recognize that, and we want to make sure that we are, using them appropriately to focus particularly on the areas that our stakeholders, really want and need us to focus on. So, it's absolutely, as you said, hardwired into the way that we think about these things.
I've just got a couple more questions for the panel before I turn to the audience. But obviously, the regulation that we're talking about here, whether it's competition or data protection, telecoms, online safety, or financial services, doesn't just end at the UK's borders. There's a whole international dimension to it as well. And I think each of the regulators will have an international strategy or approach. I wanted to kind of come to the FCA first. Is ahead of Brexit, you had a really big job to do to kind of try and prepare the financial services industry for what was looking like became a kind of very obvious cliff edge. I want to get a sense from you of what that kind of preparation was like and how it changed your relationship with your international peers.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that we, certainly from the FCA's perspective, I think we sense this very acutely, and it's very important. The markets that we regulate, these are internationally highly interconnected, complex markets, and so we operate in that context. I think, let me just say a few things very high level. We are not, post-Brexit, we won't be diverging for the sake of divergence. And we're actually not expecting or anticipating, significant, fundamental, if you like, divergence across all parts of our remit. Obviously, there is some possibility of divergence in some areas. The EU regime is still evolving, and I think where we want to create the confidence is that in everything we do, we will, for instance, we do have firms that are active in both the UK and the EU markets. It's very important to be considering holistically the costs that those firms might face then as they navigate international regulatory borders and regimes. And we will be, certainly having that in mind as we develop our own approach. We're committed to developing and maintaining the highest internationally consistent standards when it comes to financial services in service of our regulatory objectives. So, right through to the commitment that we have to good consumer outcomes and good market outcomes. So when we're expecting a degree of similarity going forward in our approach. More generally, just abstracting now, a little bit away from the sort of the UK, EU, and more globally, it's obviously vital, for all the reasons I said, that we really work well and, positively with international bodies, with counterpart regulators in other jurisdictions. And that's actually, it's not sort of nice to have on the side of desk. It's really key to delivering our strategy. And we are committed to deepening the partnerships in that context. And so if you think about something like AI, we've been very active there, and you should expect to see that continue from our side as well, building relationships, building partnerships, hosting and convening important conversations about the regulatory order sort of internationally going forward. And of course, we're very I'd say we're very supportive, of course, of the government's strategy to strengthen trade and market access post-Brexit as well. And a key part of that is that developing and deepening global financial partnerships.
And the kind of MOUs and trade agreements that sort of you've been involved in, do you feel like there's been it's been a sort of successful move after there's been a lot of engagement between yourselves and the government on that?
I would say that this is, it's obviously an area where there's active engagement and, a real focus, I think, on some shared objectives, of course, absolutely, all in service of UK consumers, market outcomes, and the sort of the greater good globally as well, I think very much so, very much looking to move actively into that space and continue to play a leadership role. And
data protection is probably and we've had a lot of discussions whether it was over adequacy and the kind of the interrelation between the EU and the UK on that. Obviously, with the new Data Protection Digital Information Bill, the government's trying to find a balance between having a more light touch, pro-innovation approach to potentially data protection regulation within the UK, but allowing broader compatibility abroad. Is that a difficult circle to square, or do you think it's the way it's set up is going to allow you to do that when it gets to enforcement and then deploying the regime?
So, first of all, I don't think it's a difficult circle to square. I think what Karen was sort of setting out there in terms of the fact this is not, the working internationally in this space, it's not a side of desk endeavour. Your members know, we know that this is a globalised economy, that data is flowing across borders, that firms are operating across borders, and that we therefore need to have the excellent partnerships with all of our counterparts to make sure that we are operating in the interests of a thriving market and in the interests of the consumers that we are here to be the voice of, here to protect. And so that means that we do have super live conversations, and actually irrespective of how our legislative frameworks evolve across the piece for any of us, or indeed in other jurisdictions, being able to pick up the phone, have a really sort of in-depth conversation about matters of regulatory interest will always be top of mind for us.
And Kate, Ofcom's obviously got a lot of experience, particularly in the kind of telecoms regulation and international standards, but you're trying to set up a new approach to online safety with sort of like-minded countries. That feels like quite a different task than the kind of the established form that you would go through, say, for example, the ITU, etc., on the telecom side.
To a degree, I suppose, but I very much agree with everything that Karen and Stephen were saying, and we've had sort of significant success already. So we've already set up the Global Online Safety Regulators Network with Australia and Ireland and Fiji to share best practices and learn from each other. And we've also set up work around other regulators who are regulating video sharing platforms, because although the Online Safety Bill is yet to be enacted, we are already regulating UK-based video sharing platforms. And the great thing about that one is that because it was an EU initiative, they're regulating the country they're based in. So us working with other regulators means that UK citizens will be protected in relation to platforms that aren't based here. despite us not regulating them. So yes, I suppose it is a bit different, but I think it is as much different because of the global nature of these players as it is anything to do with Brexit.
Yeah.
Or otherwise, I think we would have had to ensure that we were extending our sort of networks as far as possible. We already were engaging a lot with a number of these countries, but making sure that we have the sort of active conversations there, much as Karen and Stephen have already said. And
just to kind of finally come to the question of sort of digital markets, that it's always talked about how much of a kind of an international arena the CMA is operating in, particularly when it comes to the kind of approach to digital markets. I want to just get a sense from you how much your international engagement has ramped up over the course of kind of, as the CMA has taken a much more intensive focus on this stuff.
I mean, I would say, the CMA has always had very good links with the major agencies around the world. Clearly, since Brexit, we've also had to expand some of those links, and there have been some challenges in terms of information sharing, etc. But I think overall we've navigated that well, and I would expect that to continue in the future. I think there'll be more of that. Clearly, we've got things like the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act in the EU. We have got proposals for a digital markets regime in Australia. We've got other proposals, elsewhere. So I think it's just going to continue. The direction of travel is pretty clear.
Well, I've just got about 10 minutes left for audience Q&A, so I'm going to ask people to stick up their hands and I'll send a mic over to you. So I'll try and take questions in maybe batches of 2 or 3. I can see 2 over there. So we've got one, the lady sort of towards the back, and then the man in the orange T-shirt towards the front. And then there's a third question as well, which I can't see. But.
Hi, that was really interesting. Thank you so much. I'm Hannah from the Online Dating Association. So we're a trade association which represents a lot of very small businesses, but they're obviously very interested in this mix of regulation they're going to be faced with across all 4 regulators. So my question is just around consultation and engagement with those small businesses, both as individual regulators, which you obviously already do, but also as the DRCF. And just in my experience, that it's sometimes hard for small businesses to engage with those consultation processes because they're 1, 2, 3 people, and we do it as the association, but were we not here, they wouldn't do it. So just your reflections on individually and together, are you going to be doing consultation as the DRCF for these issues that overlap between you, especially in small and medium-sized businesses? Thanks.
Great. And then can we take the second question?
Hi, I'm Seb from Computer Weekly. Just wondering what the forum, the collective thinking and individually is on kind of the issues of digital sovereignty at the moment. So there's kind of a fundamental incompatibility between European data protection laws and US surveillance laws. That just resulted in a massive fine for Meta from the Irish Data Protection Authority. And, a lot of the economy's digital infrastructure runs on, AWS and Microsoft, US companies subject to these laws. And that, also impacts AI because all the data gets run through their systems. And I guess there's also a competition element in that some of these companies are just getting too big to fail. You can't tell Microsoft it can't operate in the UK because so many businesses rely on it, whether or not they should. So yeah, what is your thinking on those kind of issues and how you're working through them?
And I think there's one more question. Nope. Oh, just over there.
There's a man behind the pillar, by the way, because we can't see.
Hi, my name is Amablana Yokubeno. I'm a recent law graduate. So I do understand how there's a conglomeration of all institutions working together to kind of create a regulatory coordination. But do you perhaps sometimes believe that there is a need for an independent regulatory body to kind of work focused for just on AI, and maybe, for instance, like an oversight body that can kind of regulate, for instance, because, for instance, all institutions that you all work in have oversight bodies that kind of manage and work on every individual area of what you do. But, for instance, there are nuances, there are or intersections where, for instance, there might need to be an independent regulatory body that's working on the AI issues that are happening in the UK. I do know that the EU does have, for instance, some sort of stricter kind of role where there is a regulator that kind of works like an independent regulator. So would you think it's more advantageous for the UK to move forward with having one independent body that kind of works, and even an oversight body that kind of also like checks on those sort of areas when it comes to AI in the UK?
Okay, great. We have 3 excellent questions on consultation, digital sovereignty, and artificial intelligence. We definitely don't give you guys the easy ones. I'm going to go to Matthew on the consultation with small business thing, because that is, I think, has particularly come up with a lot of small companies we know in relation to what might happen under the digital markets bill. And I'm going to open it to the rest of the panel as well, but I'll go to Matthew first on that one. Just a sense of how you think, obviously, when this regime gets off the ground, it applies to other regulatory regimes as well. It can have large effects on small businesses, who, as Hannah has mentioned, can be quite hard to reach. How are you planning to fold them into your day-to-day decision making? Great.
Sure. So, look, we recognise the challenge, and I think obviously, associations such as yours that can represent and kind of collate information from members is clearly one of the answers to that. I think at the moment we are actively considering what guidance we need to publish in relation to the new regime. And we are thinking about that as part of our preparatory work for the new regime coming in, because clearly that enables people to engage in a much less intensive way than bilaterally necessarily, or that sort of thing. Secondly, I would say you can see from the things that have been published the idea that this is a participative approach, and the fact that we will make the effort to come out to companies rather than simply, expecting that everybody is going to come in to us, is also part of how we can approach that and make it easier. And it is super, super important to us that we do hear from stakeholders across the whole range, because this is a pro-competition, innovation led regime which is proposed, and one of its key purposes is precisely to ensure that there is space for smaller innovators to actually build on top of some of the products and services that are supplied by big tech firms, and that innovation around the edges as well as directly in those markets can be enabled.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I'm aware of time, but this is a question we're actively grappling with the online safety regime. So, it will, in scope, there will be many thousands of services. And of course, a lot of the public debate, understandably, at the moment is on the services with the biggest reach. But we are very, very actively engaged in the question of how do we properly engage with smaller services, a lot of which may just have one person, as you say, maybe 3, but maybe just 1. We can't expect sort of engagement with long regulatory documents. So I'm not pretending that we have the whole answer, but that is very, very high up on our agenda, that how we engage effectively with a long tail. I mean, for the DRCF, just very briefly, things like, I think, the multi-agency advice service, really trying to tap into how we can offer advice, sometimes to bigger services, sometimes to smaller services. But also, again, if you have ideas of things we should be doing, we don't take decisions in the DRCF, so we don't sort of consult in the usual way. But if there are things we should be doing to make this forum more accessible as well as our own individual work, please do let us know.
And just because I'm very aware of running out of time, but we had 2 questions remaining on digital sovereignty and AI. I might pass the question on digital sovereignty to Stephen, since a Schrems-related issue was raised.
Thank you. Well, look, in situations like this, I always go back to the people that we kind of work on behalf of. And actually, lots of the questions around digital sovereignty, or as if you are in the data protections field, international transfers of data, come down to questions about what people expect from how their personal data is processed, and the sorts of safeguards that are in place when that's transferred elsewhere. And that's really what that whole regime around international transfers of personal data is really set up to achieve. That treats things differently according to the risks that may exist in different jurisdictions. And that's sort of framed around that way. But I wanted to come on to a sort of a separate point, which the audience member referred to, around firms perhaps being too big to fail, or too big to for us to perhaps take on as regulators in this space. And I just wanted to sort of gently move past what I might describe as sort of black and white thinking around it's either, you know, you can operate a service, you know, or you can kind of get off scot-free, and actually just make clear that as regulators, actually we have many different ways of engaging with and influencing major technology firms to make sure that consumers' interests are represented on specific issues. And that means that we will sometimes be having a discussion with a firm that may be on the one side of things, balancing really quite a tricky regulatory conversation, and then the other side may be a very positive conversation about how we can encourage more innovation, more development of services in that space. And I think it's really important for us as regulators for us to be able to sustain both sides of that conversation simultaneously.
And we are really running out of time, but I want to kind of throw it open to the panel very quickly on the kind of AI white paper. That question was raised of that, you know, is it better to have a single regulator in the middle, potentially with more consistent rules, but maybe moving a bit slower, or moving to the more flexible system that we've got today? It'd be maybe interesting to get just a few thoughts from you about the challenges of kind of maybe putting that AI white paper into practice. I'll open up to anyone here who wants to take it.
I mean, just a couple of thoughts. So one, actually the fact that the DRCF is voluntary actually helps us move quickly, which I think is really great. You know, we've put out joint statements on privacy and safety, competition and safety, etc., and we're able to do that because we can just sort of get on with it. In terms of an independent regulatory body, you know, ultimately government can decide and Parliament can decide to sort of carve up the regulatory landscape as they like. I think the important thing, and a few people have touched on it, is that we all tend towards and operating in a sort of tech-neutral approach. And actually the important thing is the outcomes in each sector, or the outcomes in relation to privacy, or the outcomes in relation to competition in relation to AI, or a particular use of AI. And there are then cross-cutting themes, but I think it's important not to lose those sort of actual specific outcomes that we're talking about.
Anyone else, any final thoughts on AI?
I mean, I would just add, very much agree, you know, with Kate's points there. I would just add as well that, you know, one of the this personal reflection, one of the things I've observed engaging with the potential benefits and harms, say, of AI in the sector we regulate, is that even within the sector, the impact can be very use case specific, very subsector specific. So you think about, you know, deployment of AI in credit scoring versus insurance pricing, and different considerations start to arise, and a different way of understanding whether this is being deployed well in the consumer interest or less well, and so on and so forth. So I think you can't underestimate that, and it will always be important, whatever the setup, I think, you know, to have the ability to kind of, you know, go use case specific like that, which often, you know, can be done quite efficiently in a sector specific way in some cases. At the same time, there's always you know, something like AI, there's always cross-cutting considerations, generative AI, you know, thinking about quantum and so on, economies and scope and scale that Matthew talked about, when you don't have every single regulator replicating the same, you know, core fundamental sort of day one sort of investigations to sort of, you know, initially grip those prospective future technologies. But obviously, as you get into the detail of it, some tailoring and contextualization really serves you very well. So I think that's the sort of the underlying tension in a more abstract sense that, you know, I think an opportunity.
And definitely food for thought for the audience. I'm really sorry I'm going to have to bring it to an end there, but thank you very much for joining this panel. I hope this is, as the UK's regulatory regime is potentially getting more newsworthy and certainly getting to the top of your desk pile, has given you a sense of how the regulators are working together underneath the surface, not just together, but also on their own individual areas. So if you could give them a round of applause. And we are very quickly moving on to our next panel, which is on quantum computing and the future of compute, which should be really interesting.